what you would say in a lecture like this in Australia about the next 50 years for Australia?
Well, wonderful question. We have to ask Jim too, because he is much closer to Australia than I am at the moment. I would say that the wealth and prosperity of the general population in Australia is based at the moment on digging stuff up and shipping it out and not adding value to it in any way within the country. And Australians have their head in the sand about that situation and don't seem to be willing to face up to it politically. The only thing the Australian governments have done is to refuse to let China buy rights to mineral deposits in Australia, although they have given long-term leases with the condition that those employed be Australian and that a certain proportion of the profits go to the Australian government. But it is a very serious problem. Australia didn't have the recession the rest of the world had because it had the revenues from those mineral sales and because it has wonderfully regulated banks. But nonetheless, these wonderful resources are going to run out eventually. Whether in the next 50 years or not, I'm not sure, because they're huge. But you're right that is a huge problem. Jim, what would you say?
Well, I mean, the only issue that's come up in the dialogue in the last 6 months is the attempt to impose new taxes on the export of mineral wealth, and in fact, it's brought a government down. Far from people supporting the idea that we should increase the taxes on this wealth so that we at least get something back, the general population actually supported the mining industry with regard to them paying low taxes. So it was a kind of non sequitur in the end, that here we are, it's a one-off job. When you send something off, you're not going to get anything back. And yet we weren't prepared to go the extra yard and say, well, look, we'll up the taxes so we do get some revenue now rather than lost later. So there's been I would call a timidity in the relationship between the government, the people, and those corporations that dig it up. And the Chinese, of course, are just, it's divide and conquer. They don't mind the argument going on because they're getting the advantage of it. So it's a problem that hasn't matured into a proper dialogue. Yes, Catherine.
Dr. Conway, this afternoon I asked my students what they thought you would be talking about. And they said they were very optimistic that you would be talking about advances in technology and so on. And they're here tonight. And I think you said you're only talking about economic and political decline of the West. But those are pretty big areas. And I think other declines will go along with that. And if we assume that you're correct in what's going to happen, how should they prepare for that? What should be the next courses that they take? How can they best situate themselves so that they have good and happy and productive lives?
Well, I'm interested that they thought I would be optimistic about this subject. But I don't believe that economic and decline as a world power in any way needs to affect intellectual life. It might change it, but it might change it for the better. So that instead of trying to create even better mining engineers or even better designers of military weapons, as Jim was saying, we might go back to thinking about another pattern of intellectual life which could be transformative. So my advice to them would be not to fall into the terminology of decline and loss, because what's lost could be probably quite easily done away with.
And we've got a good comparison with that one, because you think of the years that Rome was a dominating force in the Mediterranean, but it always looked to Greece for its intellectual inspiration. And so Greece was, in a sense, exporting its mindset for hundreds of years over a period of time, even though politically it was insignificant and economically. So one could look upon the fact that we've got this most brilliant architecture, which is the Western mind, and we need to nurture that rather than sort of say, well, we can give that up and we can take on something else. It is the great thing that we've got, is the way we've constructed our thought processes.
So study the classics.
Yes, the classics.
James, maybe 2 more questions.
2 more questions? Well, we've got 3. So the last 3?
To be or not to be? No. First of all, I would like to just honor you as a trailblazer and as a mentor for women. And that's a segue into my question. You have been a very courageous and admirable leader. If you could maybe say what 3 characteristics of a leader you have found to be very successful that will be needed in the next 50 years, as well as what type of folks do you look for to be on your team? And maybe that's a giveaway to one of the answers.
Well, first of all, I think a really effective leader manages to deal with their opposition in a way that doesn't demean them. And that if you can do that, you can build almost any organization. You have to be not afraid to fight, but to fight in a way that doesn't demonize your opponent. You have to be confident of your own ideas, but open to others, always ready to learn. And thirdly, you have to look for very bright people and nurture them. I think that'd be it.
Next. We've got a student now.
Yeah. Hey, welcome.
Considering that the world has become increasingly interdependent, like the countries, how do you think that will affect culture, like world culture, and how people have their worldview?
Mm-hmm. Jim, why don't you start off?
Well, I think that's a good question, really. I mean, the question I was going to ask you, in fact, was how you regarded national borders in the future. Because that's the paradigm we've been living under is for the last 150, 200 years, a sense of borders of which we've made arbitrarily, particularly in the Middle East, and whether that's going to fall away, and it's going to be because of your commitment to what I'd call the other, your relationship with the other person, whether they living in the Gobi Desert or whether they're living in the South Sea Islands, that sense of respect and affection for people. I mean, one of the great issues that you see in terms of frustrations with people coming across borders, both in Australia and in America, is this sense that the other is somehow not of this world. And really, that's the big key issue. We're all of this world, and we don't actually own it. The Aborigines would tell us that, in fact, the earth owns us. Mm-hmm. And we've got this thing all upside down, and so they've always said you can't come to America, or you shouldn't come across the borders into Australia, because in fact this is ours. And it's the idea of possession, which is a common law concept from Britain, largely, effectively, I think, that has created a lot of the problems that we're seeing with regard to people coming in. So America is going to be, well, I understand it's Hispanic in its dimensions completely now. Well, Australia will no longer be a white Anglo-Saxon country in 50 years' time. And when I hear people of my generation getting angry about it, I said, you've got to learn to live with it. It's a reality. We are all people. It's not that you're Spanish and I'm Anglo-Saxon Australia. We are people first. And so your generation, the generation, is going to have to embrace that sense of the brindle in life and make it into a challenge and a joy.
I could hardly say any of that any better. The only other thing that I would say is national boundaries are a product of history. They change all the time. If you look at things in the perspective of centuries, if you look at a map of the world in 1760 and today, it would be totally different. I think that if we do not keep open borders, we will see the kind of decline that is occurring in Western Europe at the moment, and a loss of creativity. I always think what's magical about the early days of Hollywood was created by Polish Jewish and Russian Jewish geniuses, and look what we've inherited from them.
Yeah.
But people were trying to keep them out at that very time.
That's true, exactly true. Yes, last question.
Okay, last question. You mentioned that these BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, are going to take the sort of economic leadership of the world. They all have very different economic histories and different approaches to how economies develop. Also, in the sort of wake of the financial crisis that we had in 2008, do you see capitalism as still the mode of choice for economics in this century globally?
Well, yes, I do. But capitalism is many things, and it has been developed most successfully in countries where there were real constraints on the rate of accumulation of capital, what was allocated out of productivity to the state and public service, and there are other rapacious capitalist systems that really don't want to transmit any of the earnings from the productivity to the rest of society. So I think a well-regulated capitalist society is highly creative and can generate a surplus that can be put to very good use. And we have not seen a command economy really do that very successfully. What constraints would I want to put on capitalism? Well, I feel at the moment we're going through a big crisis in the healthcare system in the United States. Maybe healthcare shouldn't be seen as a private good. It should be seen much more as a public good. And we should be capable of inventing a system that could do that, whereas we've only got 1/3 of the way at the moment to doing that. So I don't know whether that's a good answer to your question, but
I guess the question I was sort of getting at was like a sort of American capitalism.
Yeah.
Will like a sort of American capitalism be the sort of center of growth, or will it be, because these countries, these BRIC countries, are either they were colonized or they have a distinct, like sort of very big command economies, like in Russia, where there's a private public relationship that's very, very strong and very hard to break.
yeah, well, in the BRIC countries, I think Russian capitalism is really freebooting and absolutely unregulated at the moment, and rife with corruption and so on. But it's also highly creative, and it's managed to grab an important part of the energy industry of its part of the world, not by necessarily very straightforward means. That's kind of buccaneer capitalism. I think Brazil, on the other hand, has gone through many iterations of different political mentalities and values, and is becoming much more a citizen of the world, readier to open its boundaries, and aware that over the last couple of generations it's developed the kind of educated workforce that can make a capitalist system work very well. Indonesia is on the way to becoming one of the key financial institution headquarters of the Asian world. And so I don't mean to suggest that I think they will all arrive at their maximum productivity and strength at the same time, but I do believe that they will balance the Western European and North American capitalism.
But another thought on that, Jill, we haven't talked about social capital.
No.
I mean, social capital is an issue that is really outside the paradigm, but it's very important. We've never put a valuation on social capital, and many of these older cultures have. Mm-hmm. And so they are often working very effectively in learning new capitalist techniques, but it's being accompanied by a social capital as a valuation that helps their societies to remain much more cohesive in that going forward thing. And I think that's something we don't look at a lot in Western societies, although France is a very strongly developed social capitalist country. It likes to protect its social capital.
Well, France is a very splendid example of a social capitalist country.
Yeah.
It was brought to that by the 1914-18 war and the destruction of a whole generation of French men. And so it began to invest in women and encouraging them to marry and produce children and make it possible for them to be self-supporting while doing it. And France has always needed to build its population in relation to Germany, which it was always afraid was coming back for another try. And so it has made it a very socially aware and concerned country. I mean, you can be a young mother in any French city and you have virtually free daycare. You can drop the infant or the toddler for your full work day, and that's respected. You don't have to rush out of the office because you have to get to daycare. But that has come out of a real demographic crisis. I don't know, I suppose one could say Scandinavian countries would be the others. Yeah. But I do think that in the not-for-profit world in the United States, there is constant generation of social capital.
Well, that's what I wanted to hear, I guess we all did. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I guess it's an opportunity now to express our appreciation to Jill Ker Conway for coming along here today and tonight. For me, it's a privilege always to be with her. This is the first time we've ever shared a podium together,
Yes,
so it's quite an exciting event for us. We're friends first before we're podiumers. But I think that I think we should all express our appreciation of the